Greetings, everybody. Joyce just passed by behind the podium, and I said, "Are you our speaker?" And she said, "No, but I was a middle child. I could be." I think this may be a subject that we all have something to say about. So I'm going to be really interested to see what Erwin has to say. And we're very fortunate in many ways that he's willing to talk to us about subjects on which he is so familiar and that he knows what he's talking about. Erwin has a long and distinguished career at the University of Washington. I think your book, and Neuropsychology, is 11th edition or something like that. That's a staggering number of editions for a textbook. And he's written on various other things having to do with social relations. So he has a lot to say on many subjects. And I think I would suspect he will also mention that he has a brother, Seymour, who is also a distinguished psychologist I knew at Yale. And I would imagine something about that's going to enter into part of what you say today. So thank you.
Eileen Allen, who once lived at Horizon House, was the nursery school teacher for my 3 children, and she was an excellent teacher. When she got older, she wrote a book entitled "I'm Glad I'm Old." The book is a good book, but I took it to have a very unfortunate title because I don't feel lucky to be old. I'd rather be 34 than 94. But there are some advantages to being old. One is that after you stop working, you can begin doing anything you want to do. Now, sometimes it's not that easy to find out exactly what it is that you want to do, but you're free. And one of the things that I've done is I've tried to pursue some topics that I never had time for, topics that I was always interested in and just couldn't do. I was so busy working on my research, writing research grants, writing papers and stuff like that, that all I could do is think about the topic that I'm going to talk about today and say, gee, I wish I could really know something about this or do something about this. And at first blush, you might stop to think that, well, what's there to know about birth order? I mean, everybody knows whether they're first, second, or seventh, or whatever they are. And does it make a difference? And the message of this talk is, it is important. We know a little bit about it, and there's an awful lot that we don't know. And what I would like to do today is tell you about the little that we do know and maybe say a little bit more about what we don't know and why we don't know. And towards the end of the talk, I'm actually going to give you a mini theory of where does all of this come from, which is something I had never thought about at all. I mean, there are differences between onlys, firstborns, laterborns, but there's virtually nothing that's been written about why is that the case. And I'm going to give you a theory about that. And I'm also going to tell you about the shortest piece of research I have ever done. It took me 5 minutes. And towards the end of the talk, I'll tell you about what the findings, which I thought were very interesting, what the results of that 5-minute piece of work was all about. And you might ask the question, well, what are all these complications that he's talking about in birth order? And I think the complications come about to a significant extent because people are complicated. Their lives are complicated. You can be born with a certain medical condition, for example, and figure out ways to work around it. And we'll see that some of the people who have characteristics, say, of only children, have learned how to work around that. And I'll give you a couple of examples, some of which were mentioned in the alert. And so the two main parts of the talk are what do we know, what we don't know, and maybe why we don't know it. And then as an aside, you may develop some hypotheses about what do Thomas Jefferson, Richard Nixon, and Irwin Saracen have in common, which is not a completely obvious kind of question. I was trying to think of a good example of how complicated people's lives are, not necessarily related to birth order. And I came across something that I was reading a couple of weeks ago about Oscar Hammerstein. Oscar Hammerstein, in my mind, was probably one of the 2 or 3 greatest lyricists in the history of popular music. And he wrote Some Enchanted Evening, for example, and a whole bunch of songs that were big hits on Broadway and throughout the world. And I personally don't think he was too sentimental. And Some Enchanted Evening is one of my favorite songs. And I know it so well I could even sing it for you, but I'm going to save that for another time. And and what I've tried to read up on Oscar Hammerstein. Who was this person? This is not a major thing in my life, but I was kind of curious. And then just by chance, I came across a biography of Oscar Hammerstein. And one of the problems that he had was difficulty in expressing feelings and emotions towards his children. His children were very, very important to him. And he felt throughout his whole life that for some reason he was unable to express it. Well, here's this guy who could write Some Enchanted Evening and didn't know how to say, I love you, to his children. And just as an outsider, this does seem to me to be a little bit of a problem. And it was a big problem for him. He was well aware of it in his life. Just one other example of how complicated people are is Calvin Coolidge, who I will not mention further in the talk. But whenever people think about Calvin Coolidge, they think of this silent Cal who doesn't have anything to say, both because of the way he is and because maybe he doesn't have any ideas either. A book was published of the love letters that Coolidge wrote to his wife. Well, and I haven't read that book, but I've seen some of the excerpts from it. But here is this man who, on the surface, seems one way, and you find out he's really quite different. And there were a couple of things that I'll start out by telling you a little bit of what we do know about these people. Onlys are rather different from later borns. They have some things in common with firstborns, and they're rather different in several ways from later borns. And one way in which they differ is, by the way, I should mention also, where do all these complications come from in the study of birth order? And I said at the beginning that it's perfect, everybody knows whether they're first, second, or seventh, or whatever they are. Yet there are some big questions about what is an only, what is a first, and so forth. And that poses a real problem. In fact, I didn't discover until about 6 weeks ago that I'm functionally an only child. I'm the youngest child in the family. I have a brother who was 11 years older than me, a sister 13 years older. And so there seemed to be no question but that, I'm the last child in the family. And when I was studying the literature on birth order, what I found was there were some conventions in how people do research. And whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, the fact is that people who are the youngest by 6 years in the family are functionally like onlys and firsts. And so, at the tender age of 94, I found out I was an only child. And that's a good example also of the complexities of doing research. I mean, you think, well, this is obvious or that's obvious, and you find out that it isn't. And I'm struggling now with how to deal with the fact that I'm an only child, which I hadn't thought about before. And only children and firstborns tend to be more introverted than laterborns. Now, the minute I say that, I can think of all the problems with what I've just said. I mean, the research shows that that's the case. And I'll give examples a little later of just that phenomenon. But as I look at myself, I see myself as being kind of a mixture of introvert and extrovert. I was an extroverted kid in that I think I spent plenty of time playing with other kids, playing football and baseball with other kids, either in the playground or on the street. I had friends, and in fact, one of the most significant aspects of my childhood was my involvement with Willie Robbins and David Joel Pasamanik, who happened to be two kids who lived in the neighborhood. And just by chance, it turned out Willie Robbins' father had a gas station a couple of blocks down the street. And abutting the gas station was a huge vacant lot. And I would estimate that over a period of a couple of years, David, Joel, and Willie and I, and later Jason Rubin was admitted on a part-time basis into the group, spent hours and hours and hours planning what to do with the vacant lot. I mean, how would we get rid of all this stuff that's already there? Should we build apartment houses? I can't tell you now exactly what we talked about, but my guess is we talked probably for 700 or 800 hours. And I was a participant in those discussions. So you might say, well, this was a very extroverted kid, me. But that's not the way I was at home. I didn't have any peers in my family. I had a very good relationship with my brother and with my sister, but they weren't peer relationships. My sister took me to see Ethiopians in South Pacific. She took me to see Oklahoma. She took me to see Carousel when they were all on Broadway. And then she took me out to dinner afterwards. It was a very rewarding relationship. And I had good experiences with Seymour also. So it wasn't a matter of good, bad. It was a different kind of relationship. And I was kind of off by myself. Everybody treated me like a child, and I was really the only child in the family, so that functionally I was an only child. And at home, I did a lot of the things that only children are supposed to do. That is, engage in solitary activities. And when I was 11, I had the thought that I would write an encyclopedia. And I started with A, and I don't think I ever even got through a tenth of A, and was collecting material to put in it. Well, this is all nice, it's great, but this is a kind of a lonely activity. It's a solitary activity. I spent tremendous amounts of time listening to the radio, to the baseball games, to the Churchill Downs races, and occasionally the introversion and the extroversion sort of came together. One way in which they came together is reflected in something that happened when I was in the 5th grade. Miss Bryce had the thought that maybe we should have an hour a week for the kids in the class to get up in front of the class and do whatever they want to do. Say anything they want to say, comment on things. And these solitary activities that I did at home, I used by going up to the front of the class and performing. And I did a whole bunch of things which I'm a little embarrassed even now to say that I did. For example, one of my most popular exhibitions in front of the 5th grade class was giving an imitation of Clem McCarthy announcing the Preakness race. And it was all there was nothing original in what I did. It was all imitative. And what Clem McCarthy would do is his voice would get lower and lower and lower. You know, the horses are now approaching the starting gate, and you could barely hear him on the radio. And then he would boom out, and they're off. And then he would call the rest of the race. But the big thing was, and they're off. And the kids thought that was absolutely wonderful. Another thing that I did was, part of my listening to the radio included listening to the news between 7:45 and 8 o'clock on CBS. And I would occasionally present a little, quote, commentary on what was going on in the Second World War. And it was all imitative. There was absolutely nothing original in that. But the kids would after the class, ask me questions as if I knew anything about the topic, because all I was doing was spewing something out. So there are some things that we know, and I just made a couple of lists for myself of what are some general statements that could be made about firsts and onlys. And I just did this to help myself. They tend to be quite reliable people. They tend to be ambitious, not in a nasty way, but they want to accomplish things. They're reliable. They're meticulous in some respects. I haven't done any research on the topic, but I would bet you that a lot of compulsive people are firstborns or onlys. What about what about the middles? Well, they tend to be people who are mediators, people who try to smooth things over and are often quite successful at smoothing things over. So I'm not going to do it, but it'd be kind of interesting to study diplomats and to find out where they are in birth order. And nothing is known about that topic. Now, they also tend to be loyal. They tend to be good managers. And lastborns tend to be outgoing, enjoying contact with other people, being good members of teams, and also having a good sense of humor. So all of these things seem to be true, even though there hasn't been enough work done on the topic. The problem is the point that I made earlier about life is complicated. And you might be first, second, third, or seventh, or whatever, but your genes make a difference. Your experiences make a difference. What your parents think childhood should be makes a difference also. So that, and culture makes a difference, and gender makes a difference. I mean, for a long time, parents would worry about, will it be a boy? Well, fortunately, that's dying out now, and I think people are generally happy to get whatever they get. But there are all these issues that have to be dealt with and have not been dealt with. So there are these many other factors, and what this means for research is the research has to be more ambitious than it has been. You can't just study a couple of dozen people if you're going to take any of these factors that I've been mentioning into account. And maybe looking at some examples would be suggestive of what we know and some of what we don't know about birth order. And a good example of some of the points that I've already made is Thomas Jefferson. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson is one of the heroes of American history. And he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So he's greatly revered, even though there are some other questions that have been raised about Thomas Jefferson recently. He was the oldest child in his family. He was very shy. He did not feel comfortable interacting with other people. So that, and throughout his whole life, he never looked forward to going to parties. It was more than that. He would avoid going to parties. And he ended up being someone, and he had other accomplishments besides the Declaration of Independence. He was the president. It was his idea to send Lewis and Clark on their expedition. He did all kinds of things. He was the American ambassador to Paris. And what is interesting about him is he learned some workarounds. He wasn't good with people. He didn't like giving speeches. Of course, today you'd wonder, how could someone like that even run for president with those characteristics? Because it would seem to be a handicap. But in those days, he could get away with it, I suppose. But he made tremendous contributions, and yet he had these limitations. Richard Nixon, and this illustrates one of the problems of doing research on first, onlys, and later borns. Richard Nixon was the second boy in his family. But when he was 3 or 4, his brother developed a pulmonary condition which required that he be in a very arid environment. And so Richard Nixon's brother was taken by their mother to Arizona and essentially lived in Arizona for several years until the brother died at a very early age. But functionally, Nixon was an only child in the same way that perhaps you might say I was functionally an only child. And he was a very introverted person. Now you might say, how in the world could someone get elected president in the 20th century and be introverted? He was able to do it because people have all kinds of limitations and things they can't do, and we're pretty good at developing workarounds. And he was, as I was in the 5th grade, something of an exhibitionist with a bunch of other people. And he became very good as a debater. He didn't like to go to parties, just as Thomas Jefferson didn't like to go to parties. He was totally unable when he was president to fire anybody. If anybody had to get fired, he would call in Ehrlichman and tell John Ehrlichman, get rid of that person, because he couldn't do it. So he developed some workarounds. We tend to think of Nixon as being kind of a cold, scheming individual. And in some respects, he probably was, and probably all leaders have to be that way to some extent. Although, he hid his shyness. When Nixon was running as the vice presidential candidate with Dwight Eisenhower, somebody accused him of getting money, getting a slush fund from rich people to spend on himself. And this was publicized, and there was pressure on Eisenhower to get rid of Nixon. And Eisenhower really wasn't interested in the whole thing. He wanted the whole thing to go away. So he couldn't make up his mind. And Nixon had the idea, I'm going to give a talk to the American public and explain the whole thing to them. And then Eisenhower can decide what he wants to do. And so Nixon gave one of the best performances anybody has ever given. And some of you may even remember the talk. He talked about the fact that his wife has a nice cloth coat and does not own a fur coat. He said all kinds of things about the finances of the family, that they didn't have money for this and they didn't have money for that. The talk was an overwhelming success. And the next day, Eisenhower said all kinds of wonderful things about Nixon. So here was this guy who was able to put on a performance like the speech. He was still the person that he was, but he had learned workarounds. He also had some warmth to him that is often not paid attention to. When he was in law school at Duke University, there was one of the students was in a wheelchair, and the lecture hall was 15 steps up in the building. For a year, Nixon got up an hour earlier every day in order to help carry the wheelchair up the stairs. Now, people have all kinds of views about Nixon, but I think most people would not expect that kind of, quote, softness from Nixon. This is something that wrote to his wife a little bit on the lines of what I was referring to when I mentioned Coolidge. This is what he wrote to his wife. During the past few days with the rain falling, I've thought of you many times, good thoughts too. Every day and every night I want to see you and be with you. Yet I have no feeling of selfish ownership or jealousy. Well, he goes on further beyond that. But the point is, it's a talk full of warmth, which I don't think came across to the public. I mean, he was successful in the talk that I was mentioning before, and he was successful in many of the things that he did, and he was effective. But I don't think many people would say, well, Nixon was a really warm person. And yet, there was a piece of him that had a lot of it. And I found that quite interesting. And in fact, one other point about Nixon, he didn't like small groups, but he had a friend, someone by the name of Bebe Rebozo, who lived in Florida. And when things got to be tough for Nixon, he would get on a plane and go down and spend a few days with Bebe Rebozo. And sometimes an hour would go by and neither would say a word to the other, because Rebozo was very much like Nixon. And so, again, it's an example of a workaround. And I think I've mentioned enough about myself, so that I'm just sticking myself in with Jefferson and Nixon. And I thought I would tell you about my 5-minute research study. A lot is known about the birth orders of the presidents of the United States. So that's no big deal. But I thought it was a triumph when I found it 6 or 7 weeks ago. Another thing that I had been unaware of was that the American History Association every year asks its members who study American history to list the presidents of the United States in order from the best to the worst. And I got that list. And then my study was simply, it was very arbitrary. And I'm exaggerating when I call it a piece of research. But what I did was, I picked out the 8 best, on the basis of these ratings, the 8 best and the 8 worst presidents of the United States. The best ones included the 2 Roosevelts, Washington, Lincoln, and some others. And what I found, and so I then related birth order to the presidents in these 2 categories. And what I found was 7 of the 8 best presidents of the United States were firsts or onlys. 1 of the worst presidents of the United States was a first or an only. And that's probably the clearest research result I've ever gotten, but even though it was based on only a few minutes of work. And so one of the thoughts that I've been mulling over is what could account for these kinds of differences? And totally by accident and unrelated to what I've been talking about is another interest that I've had, and that is, what's the effect of illness on the lives of people? And actually, I've thought about this often in terms of my brother. My brother had polio when he was 15. And both arms were affected, one more than the right more than the left. And about a year before my brother died, he and I were just sitting around and chatting. And he happened to mention that he didn't know how to account. He didn't know how to describe his polio. I mean, it'd be hard to think of a greater tragedy to hit anybody. And the thing that puzzled Seymour was that, in a way, it was the best thing that ever happened to him. This is just one way of thinking about it. Because no one in my family had ever graduated from high school. And it was perfectly obvious that Seymour was not going to be able to work in a factory because he had limited use of his left arm and very limited use of his right arm. Well, with the help of the New Jersey State Rehabilitation Commission, he went to college and he got a PhD, and then he became a professor at Yale for 40 years. And what Seymour said was, well, how am I supposed to think about how am I supposed to think about my polio when I've lived this advantaged life that has been very, very satisfying? And then the thought occurred to me, what about me? That I would never have gone to college had it not been for the fact that Seymour went to college and the psychology of the family underwent a change. And as I look back on my own life, I say to myself, what an advantaged history you have, I have. Which is another example of a point that was made earlier in the talk, and that is that birth order is not the only thing in the world. It's an important factor, but there are other things that play a role as well. So anyway, I've been interested in what does illness do to people? And what I found is, in a way, you might think about creative maladies, the good things that come out of the bad things. If you look at someone like Charles Darwin, for example, he was kind of a happy-go-lucky person who went on this trip on the Beagle for 5 years, did very valuable work, and developed the bases for his evolutionary theory, which didn't come out until he got home. He had been healthy for almost all of his life until he got back from the trip on the Beagle, and he was sick for the rest of his life. And he was very introverted and very lonely. And in fact, he was a quite solitary person. And he often speculated, is there a connection between my being a solitary person and coming up with this theory of evolution? And I don't think we'll ever have a complete answer. And by the way, Darwin was the second oldest son in his family, but he was 5 years younger than the next older son in the family. So he was pretty close to the 6-year cutoff point that I was talking about. What he got on the voyage of the Beagle was glimmerings of the idea of the mutability of behavior and function in animals and in people. And I've come across other people who have made big contributions, not because they were sick, but the sickness created the kind of the social isolation that led to the production of significant achievements, kind of like my encyclopedia, which was somewhat aborted. Perhaps the best example of the complications of all of this is Beethoven. Beethoven never heard his Ninth Symphony. he didn't hear about a number of his other works as well. He was able to write the Ninth Symphony, but he never heard it. And Beethoven was a very solitary kind of person. He's kind of a crabby person in some ways also. But one wonders, and one wonders about the Ninth Symphony, which is a very important hit symphony in the history of music, because it was the first symphony ever written in which there was a very significant vocal part to it, based on Schiller's poem, The Ode to Joy. But he never heard about that. And I have come to the idea, based on the work on birth order and what's known about the effects of illness on behavior, I've come to the feeling, and this could be all wrong because there's no evidence on it, I've come to the feeling that there are some benefits to social isolation, just as there are some benefits to getting old. And maybe that's what Eileen Allen was talking about. But I think the characteristic that is, or the experience that is common to firsts and onlys and to people who have long-term illnesses is that they become, to some extent, socially isolated. And why is this the case? And what does it all mean? Well, I was going to sing portions of the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but I think I'm going to forego that for the present. So I'd be happy to hear any of your comments or answer any questions that I might be able to. Jack, do you have? Oh, fine.
Could you explore the middles a little bit more?
Well, the reason I haven't said that much about the middles is there hasn't been that much done. I mean, the firsts and the onlys and the lasts are kind of, they seem special. And the middles tend to be kind of normal, happy people who are good at making peace if there's any opportunity for doing so. So, in a way, but the middles do not have some of the great achievements that some firsts and onlys have. So it isn't as though one thing is better than another, but there are different characteristics.
Erwin, wonderful musings. Referring to your 5 minutes of research, how many of the 8 worst presidents were firsts or onlys? Well, only one was a first or an only. 7 were not. And most of the ones who were among the 7, most of them were socially active, kind of happy, effective people. I mean, you don't get to be elected president unless you have a certain degree of effectiveness. But Calvin Coolidge is an example of someone in the lower 8. And, you know, Cal thought the best thing to do is to be quiet unless you've really got something you've got to say. And so he didn't offer any ambitious programs. Actually, I also did some work on the top, after I did the top 8 and the bottom 9, I also looked at a few of the others as well. And it all seemed kind of consistent with what I was saying, that the really big achievers are the firsts and the onlys. Why that is not known. I think it has something to do with spending a lot of time by yourself, doing all kinds of things. In my case, it was something as trivial as listening to the radio. I mean, I often wonder how I got decent grades in school, because I would look forward to getting a cold and having to stay home so I could listen to the Romance of Helen Trent on the radio. And so, I mean, these were not big activities. I remember sitting in the living room on December 7th, 1941, listening to the football game of Chicago and Washington, and feeling very annoyed that they kept interrupting the game in order to give information about what was going on at Pearl Harbor. And it's another good example of my solitary involvements at home, which I don't think anybody knew about, and I obviously did not care about.
I'm wondering about the effect of the fact that firstborns are the experiment of the parents. It's the first time parents have had a child. And so a lot of experimenting goes on. And as they have more children, they may very often treat them a little bit differently because they learn. So the firstborn is also the object of experiment.
That's a very good point. And I think there's virtually nothing known about what you're asking about, but it's very important. And kind of underlines the point that I made earlier in the talk about what's needed is more ambitious work. That it isn't sufficient simply to label somebody as only, first, later, whatever.
Erwin, I had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. When I remarried, my second husband had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. I think the gender of the older children has an impact on the tenor of the family, too.
Oh. Yes, I would hope that that effect is less than it had been. But that was the case. If you look at things written in the 19th and early 20th centuries, boys were the prizes that were wanted. And I mean, most people today, at least, they would at least have difficulty saying that, and I would hope feeling that as well.
Well, it's just that boys act out more, girls are more nurturing and so on, and I think it makes a different feeling in the family.
Yeah, that's probably the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was my impression that when we went into lockdown at the beginning of the pandemic, that and the only person you might see that day, and you might not even see them, was the person that brought your dinner. And I have the impression that only children weathered that better. We knew what to do for ourselves.
Who is it who knew what to do?
Pardon?
Who were the people who knew what to do?
No, it's not that people knew what to do. It's they brought you. They brought your meals, and you might see them, you might not. They might just leave them at your door, and that's all. You didn't see anybody else for quite a while until people figured out things, and we knew we got.
But you said you thought the onlys got along better than
I thought the onlys got along better.
This is totally irrelevant, but I just thought of one other thing about Beethoven. Beethoven's mother had been married, and she had had 2 children by the previous marriage. And so essentially, Beethoven was the 3rd child in the family. But the son died at a very early age, and girls were not considered to be of any particular importance. So that functionally, Beethoven was an only child if you go by the second marriage.
Sure.
I have a question. What about kids who are only in the middle? I have two brothers and I had two brothers and two sisters. I was right in the middle. What about kids who are in the middle?
The kids in the middle tend to be, it's a very interesting question, but the kids in the middle tend to be kind of content because they have peers, they have brothers and or sisters not too far away. But there are older people in the family also, and they tend to be, what you might say, more outgoing than a lot of other people. And they tend to be especially good at making peace, at achieving settlements that everybody can live with. And that might have to do with, in big families, that's probably one of the things that's very important, is you have to learn how to deal with the people who are older than you, younger than you, have different kinds of interests than you have. But I think middle kids tend to have a lot of the characteristics that everybody would like to have. So maybe you're lucky.
So what happened to the vacant lot next to the gas station after your 700 hours of deep thinking and planning?
I have no, it's a very good point. But although I think a more interesting question is the one that I brought up, how can you sit and talk for hundreds of hours? I mean, this didn't go on for a week. It went on for years. And it was the planning and the discussion. And I haven't even mentioned some of the complications that we had to consider, because Willie Robbins' father's gas station was on one side of the vacant lot, and David Joel Pasamanik lived in a house that abutted on the other side of the lot. So these two people had a stake in it.
And I grew up, and when I was 10 to 13, there was a vacant lot. And we did a very different thing with it. We went out and played and did games and ran around and swung across a little creek on a little, it was great.
That's wonderful.
So we had two different, very different great times.
Would you please speak a little bit about the youngest child in the family?
Well, it depends. A big factor in thinking about the youngest in the family is how much younger is the youngest child than others. If the child is 2 or 3 years younger, that child can form a peer relationship with the next child, or maybe even a couple of childs up if it's a big family. But, and that's probably a critical point, is what are the age differences? If the age differences are small, you're going to end up with a relatively contented person who might not seem quite as ambitious as the firsts and the onlys, but in some respects be happier than they are.
I am first. I did have a sister who was 4 years younger than I, and we had almost no interactions, but I had my version of your encyclopedia. I decided that I was going to have the biggest zoo that anybody ever had. And at those days, the various zoos had brochures and things, so I was writing to all the zoos around North America and getting lists of the animals that they had and comprising my list. And I had an enormous list. You wouldn't believe this zoo. Obviously, I thought absolutely nothing about any of the details, how you take care of them or anything like that, but boy, did I have a list.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I had a relationship in fantasy with all of these people that I listened to on the radio. For example, one of my big heroes was Red Barber. And
he was among the imitations that I gave in Miss Bryce's class also. But, I would, without thinking about it, talk about someone being in the catbird seat, which was something that Red Barber, when it's 3-0, the batter is in the catbird seat, because the pitcher's going to have to come across with a pretty good pitch. And, and my ambitions in life at that time was, if I could be anything like Red Barber or Clem McCarthy, I'd have it made. Didn't quite work out that way.
What about the idea that none of us were raised in the same family? I was raised in a family with a mother, father, and a sister, and she was raised in a family with a mother and father and a brother. So none of us have ever been raised in the same family as our siblings.
That's a very good point, because, and one could give examples of people in situations like the one that you described who never really develop a close relationship, or at least the kind of close relationship they would want with their successor family. And in other cases, that isn't true at all. And I think it depends in part on the attitudes and needs of the parents in the successor families that are raised. So I don't think you could give an easy answer. I think there are big differences, and the other factors besides birth order, like genes, temperament, personality, interests, abilities, all of these things may end up being much more important.
Time for one more question.
Ina?
Is there any difference in the relationship between the eldest and the parent, let's say the mother or the father, and the youngest, and or whatever order it would have been?
What sort of relationship are you thinking
well,
about?
Closeness. Did the mother, let's say, love the eldest more, and the last one was, well, you're there and the others can take care of you, and so there wasn't that bonding? Is this just a fantasy that this happens, or is there a reality to it?
What happens?
That the eldest feels much more accepted by the parent, and the youngest, let's say, is on his own or her own.
There's actually quite a bit of evidence showing that firsts and onlys frequently are most satisfied in interacting with adults than they are with peers. And so firsts and onlys often have quite good relationships with their parents, because the firsts and the onlys identify with the parents. They see themselves as becoming like the parents and wanting to be like the parents. Whereas if you're a middle child, it's quite different, because you already have your relationships with peers as well as with the kids outside as well. It's a good point.
Just a quick comment. First, back to Calvin Coolidge. One more quip. I don't know whether you know that.
Now we're getting to your heroes?
No. It's interesting that I don't know whether people know. He was really called Silent Cal. So when they told somebody that he died, they said, "How can you tell?" Actually, there has been some systematic work done that we probably should at least mention in passing. Stan Schachter at Columbia was very interested in discovering unexpectedly that despite all the messiness we've talked about family constellations and so on, that birth order turns out to be a strong predictor of some things. For example, only child are much more likely to be fighter pilots flying alone. Later children are much more likely to be in bomber crews. Only children are much more likely to be in athletics where they are alone, for instance, the Olympics. Later children are much more likely to be in team sports. And he thought this was so interesting that he tried to explore it systematically, and we don't have time for the details, but he actually wrote a book called The Psychology of Affiliation, where he tried to get at this experimentally. And essentially what he did was set up a number of experimental situations of stressors where people were put under stress and were given the opportunity either to stay alone or to be with other people. Firstborns wanted to stay alone. Later children wanted to affiliate with other people. So it even held up experimentally when you had the details to work with.
Something that I was going to mention earlier but forgot to mention was a couple of years ago, the New York Times had an article in the sports section about who were the big base stealers in baseball. And what they found was almost, if you take the 10 biggest base stealers, none of them was a first or an only. Many of them were the last born, and there was a mixture of middleborns as well. And so that relates to another characteristic, and that is later born people are more willing to take risks. Firsts and onlys are very careful. They watch their pensions very carefully. And I mean, that's true of me. I will knock myself out to save 19 cents at the QFC. And, you know, it's totally irrational. And yet it's to some extent a piece of me.
Irwin, thank you very much.
Well, great. Thank you.